In October 1949, from Tiananmen Square in Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, marking a transformative moment not only for the nation but for the global balance of power. Having devoted decades to revolutionary struggle, the 55-year-old chairman now wielded unchallenged authority, earned through his leadership against Japanese occupation and nationalist forces alike. Though never a natural public speaker, Mao possessed a commanding personal charisma, combined with a capacity for deep strategic thinking, shrewd political maneuvering, and powerful written expression that had made him the undisputed center of the communist movement. Since 1938, he had been married to his fourth wife, Jiang Qing, a former actress of fierce personality and intense loyalty, who harbored deep suspicions of those she regarded as rivals to her husband's authority. Power within the new state was concentrated in the upper tiers of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly in the Politburo Standing Committee, whose members included Liu Shaoqi, a veteran labor organizer with extensive Soviet training, and Zhou Enlai, a skilled diplomat and former revolutionary commander who would serve as the country's first premier and foreign minister. Though Mao described his government as a people's democratic dictatorship, democratic governance was never genuinely on offer. What followed instead was a sweeping reimposition of centralized authority over a country impoverished by decades of war, invasion, and instability and hungry for rebuilding. The new government moved quickly to reshape Chinese society along Soviet-inspired lines, and approximately 10,000 Soviet advisors arrived to assist in reconstruction, bringing with them both technical expertise and ideological frameworks. Among the most consequential early measures was land reform. Rural landlords, whose dominance over the peasantry had persisted for centuries, were denounced, subjected to public trials, and executed in large numbers, with estimates placing the death toll at over 1 million. Their land was redistributed to roughly 300 million peasants over the following 3 years, fulfilling a promise that had long been central to communist mobilization in the countryside. Alongside land reform, the government pursued broader social transformation, improving legal protections for women, launching literacy campaigns built around a simplified Chinese writing system, and deploying extensive propaganda through theaters, posters, and public storytelling to instill revolutionary values across a vast and largely rural population. Suspected counter-revolutionary, including nationalist sympathizers, corrupt officials, and members of the capitalist class, were targeted in successive campaigns that resulted in public humiliation, loss of property, imprisonment, and in many cases death, fundamentally overturning China's traditional class hierarchies and leaving hundreds of thousands impoverished or broken. On the international stage, the People's Republic found itself immediately at odds with the Western powers, who continued to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, officially the Republic of China, which had retreated to Taiwan following the communist victory on the mainland. With no prospect of Western diplomatic or economic support, Mao traveled to Moscow in December 1949 for 3 months of extended negotiations with Joseph Stalin. Their relationship was complicated by Mao's history of resisting Soviet-backed rivals within his own party, but strategic interests aligned sufficiently for the two leaders to sign a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance in February 1950, opening channels for substantial economic and military cooperation. The new government also moved to consolidate territorial control over regions that had drifted from Chinese authority following the collapse of the Qing dynasty, sending the People's Liberation Army into Xinjiang in 1949 and occupying Tibet in 1951, following a brief military campaign that Beijing described with considerable euphemism as a peaceful liberation. The Dalai Lama was initially permitted to remain as the head of a local administration, though this arrangement would not endure indefinitely. Outer Mongolia, now firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence, was left alone. The most immediate external crisis came on the Korean peninsula. Following the North Korean invasion of South Korea in June 1950 and the subsequent intervention of United Nations forces under American command, the conflict quickly drew close to China's northeastern border. Fearing a hostile military presence along the Yalu River and seeking to preserve a communist neighbor, Mao committed Chinese forces to the war on a massive scale, eventually deploying more than 2 million troops against the advancing UN armies. The intervention pushed UN forces back southward and ultimately produced a military stalemate along the 38th parallel, where an armistice was signed in 1953 establishing the heavily fortified, demilitarized zone that still divides the peninsula to this day. Chinese propaganda presented the outcome as a great victory, and domestically the conflict significantly bolstered the Communist Party's legitimacy, demonstrating its willingness to confront American military power directly. The human cost was nonetheless enormous, with Chinese military casualties estimated at well over 500,000. Among them Mao Anying, the chairman's own son, killed in an American airstrike while serving with Chinese forces. The war also hardened the United States' political and military commitment to Taiwan and prompted a comprehensive trade embargo against the People's Republic that would persist and shape Chinese economic development for decades. Domestically, the government launched its first five-year plan in 1953. Modeled closely on Soviet economic programs and aimed at rapidly industrializing a country that remained overwhelmingly agrarian. With substantial Soviet technical assistance, the plan achieved genuinely impressive results in infrastructure, transportation, and heavy industry, with production of coal, iron, and steel all exceeding their ambitious targets, and the country becoming a meaningful oil producer for the first time. Agriculture was simultaneously to be transformed through collectivization, with farmers organized into cooperatives of dozens or even hundreds of households that pooled land, tools, and harvests under collective management. By 1956, approximately 80% of peasant households had been absorbed into such cooperatives. The collectivization drive served both economic and ideological purposes, tightening party control over the rhythms and social organization of rural life while dismantling farming arrangements that had persisted for generations. That same year, in what appeared to be a gesture toward intellectual openness, Mao invited criticism and debate with the slogan encouraging 100 flowers to bloom and 100 schools of thought to contend. The response was not what the leadership anticipated. Academics, scientists, and intellectuals voiced substantial and wide-ranging criticism of party governance, competence, and direction. Mao and the leadership reacted with alarm and undisguised anger. An anti-rightist campaign was swiftly launched that punished at least 500,000 people deemed insufficiently loyal to the party, through mechanisms including public humiliation, hard labor camps, and in some cases execution. Among the figures who helped lead this repression was Deng Xiaoping, a Long March veteran who had recently joined the Politburo Standing Committee and would prove to be one of the most consequential political figures in 20th century Chinese history. In 1958, Mao unveiled his most audacious undertaking yet. The Great Leap Forward was an accelerated mass mobilization program intended to transform China into a fully socialist industrial society and dramatically close the economic gap with the world's leading nations within a single generation. Rural cooperatives were merged into enormous people's communes, in which the state controlled virtually every dimension of daily existence, owning the land, purchasing harvests at fixed prices, and distributing food rations. Private cooking was abolished as an expression of selfish individualism and replaced with communal canteens intended to embody collective socialist values. The campaign was accompanied by an overwhelming propaganda effort, urging every citizen to sacrifice personal comfort and strive wholeheartedly in service of Mao's transformative vision. Almost immediately, the distance between ambition and reality became catastrophic. The purges of preceding years had removed many of the qualified technicians, agronomists, and administrators who might otherwise have managed such a vast undertaking with any degree of competence. Local party officials, facing intense and unrelenting pressure to demonstrate compliance with centrally mandated targets, falsified production data on a massive and systematic scale, reporting surpluses of grain that simply did not exist. On the basis of these entirely fictitious figures, the state extracted enormous quantities of grain from the communes to supply urban populations, often leaving farming communities without sufficient food to sustain themselves through the winter. Simultaneous mismanagement, drought across key agricultural regions, and endemic corruption caused actual agricultural output to collapse precipitously. Peasants were also diverted from farming to operate backyard furnaces intended to produce iron and steel, much of which turned out to be of such poor quality as to be entirely unusable for any practical purpose. The result was one of the most devastating famines in recorded human history. Scholarly estimates suggest that at least 45 million people died in excess of normal mortality rates as a direct consequence of these policies, representing approximately 7% of China's total population and constituting one of the gravest man-made catastrophes of the modern era. Entire communes perished. The winter of 1960 visited conditions of extraordinary and unrelenting suffering across vast stretches of the Chinese countryside. Dissent within the party itself surfaced in the summer of 1959 at a leadership conference at Lashan, where Defense Minister Peng Dehuai directly and courageously challenged Mao's policies and leadership judgment. Mao was entirely unmoved by the criticism. Peng was placed under house arrest and stripped of all his positions. His replacement as defense minister was General Lin Bao, among the most devoted and unquestioning of Mao's loyalists within the military establishment. As the evidence of famine became impossible to conceal or suppress any further, even Mao acknowledged publicly that serious errors had been made, though he retained his chairmanship of the party and his ultimate political authority throughout. Practical day-to-day governance passed increasingly to Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping, who began carefully and pragmatically dismantling some of the most destructive policies. Communes were reduced in size, communal canteens were abolished, and limited private farming was cautiously permitted once again. Yet the party's comprehensive control over daily life through the work unit system, which mediated citizens' access to housing, healthcare, education, and employment, remained fully and firmly intact. Food continued to be rationed throughout this difficult period of recovery and adjustment. On the foreign policy front, tensions with both Taiwan and the Soviet Union intensified sharply during these years. In August 1958, Chinese forces began sustained artillery bombardment of nationalist-held islands in the Taiwan Strait, prompting a serious and forceful American response that included the deployment of naval and air reinforcements to the region and an explicit willingness to employ nuclear weapons if the situation escalated further. The crisis eventually subsided into a tense standoff but deeply alarmed Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who was at that time pursuing a strategy of peaceful coexistence with the West and regarded Mao's provocations as dangerously reckless. Ideological friction between Beijing and Moscow had been accumulating steadily since Khrushchev's landmark 1956 denunciation of Stalinist excesses and the cult of personality, a critique that Mao interpreted as a direct and threatening challenge to his own style of leadership. Mao condemned Khrushchev's evolving positions as a fundamental betrayal of revolutionary communist principles and an unacceptable accommodation with imperialism. After 1959, the two leaders never met again, and the Sino-Soviet split became a defining and enduring feature of international communist politics for the remainder of the Cold War. The Soviet Union withdrew all technical assistance from Chinese weapons development programs, a significant blow that China was determined to overcome through its own efforts. In Tibet, a popular uprising against Chinese rule in 1959 was suppressed following 3 days of intense street fighting in Lhasa. The Dalai Lama fled across the Himalayas to India with tens of thousands of followers, and Tibet was brought under direct and unmediated Chinese administration with no remaining local autonomy. A border conflict with India in 1962 further demonstrated China's willingness to assert itself militarily in territorial disputes, while the Soviet Union's decision to support India over China in that conflict underscored how completely and irreversibly the Sino-Soviet relationship had broken down. China's growing independence from Soviet technical support did not slow its most strategically significant scientific ambitions. Investment in domestic research institutions and higher education, including the founding of the University of Science and Technology of China in Beijing in 1958, helped cultivate the indigenous expertise required for advanced development programs. In 1964, China successfully detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in Xinjiang province, and just 2 years later, it tested a thermonuclear device, making China the 5th nation in the world to possess hydrogen bomb capability. Beijing adopted a no-first-use policy, formally distinguishing its stated nuclear posture from those of the other nuclear powers, but the tests unmistakably announced China's arrival as a strategic force that could no longer be marginalized or dismissed in global affairs. Meanwhile, a significant reform in written communication was gradually reshaping how Chinese names and places were rendered for international audiences. The pinyin romanization system, formally adopted in 1958, replaced older and inconsistent transliteration conventions and would eventually lead to the international renaming of cities such as Peking to Beijing, Canton to Guangzhou, and Nanking to Nanjing, among countless others, though widespread adoption outside China itself did not fully occur until the 1980s. By the mid-1960s, the People's Republic had survived catastrophic famine, deepening international isolation and the total rupture of its most important foreign alliance, and Mao Zedong, Though temporarily sidelined by the political consequences of the Great Leap Forward's failures, was already preparing to reassert his personal authority through a sweeping new campaign of radical social transformation that would once again convulse Chinese society from its foundations and leave a legacy of division and trauma that would outlast the chairman himself.